Harry Shukman is a journalist and latterly working for Hope Not Hate and infiltrating far-right groups. In fact, he spent pretty much a whole year undercover in the British far-right. And he joins me now because you have told the story in a new book, Harry, Year of the Rat. I'm so stupid, it took me 5 minutes to work out why you'd call it, why it was called Year of the Rat. Sorry. My friend Johnny said, make sure you ask him about the time that he thought he'd been busted when the big bloke got into the car with him. So that's my first question.
That would be when Andy Frayne, nicknamed Nightmare, a former football hooligan with the Chelsea Headhunters and Combat 18 terrorist, got into the passenger seat of my car. Obviously very worried about what might happen. It turned out he just wanted a lift to the pub, and he spoke about the curry he'd had the night before. But one of the different occasions at which I found myself hanging out with people who had a very violent past. You
reveal quite a lot about the tricks of the trade, don't you? Cameras, wires, holes in clothing. Could you have made it easier for people to spot future Harry Shukmans?
I did think
worried about this.
Yeah, I did think about this quite a lot. The equipment that we used, is available in every high street spy store, and journalists in the past have been quite open about what kind of equipment they use, how it works. There have been a lot of memoirs by former News of the World journalists, yes. Big Amazon Prime documentary about the fake shake, going into lavish detail about how cameras are stored and where. And ultimately, the far right is becoming increasingly sophisticated. I met people, one of the occasions I was nearly rumbled, people who knew about what kind of camera I was wearing at the time, not knowing I was wearing one, and where to look for it. So I think that there needs to be probably a bit more of a catch-up in what kind of equipment journalists use, and to know that actually these kinds of devices have been around for years.
Fair enough. 9 different groups. You how did you pick them?
So we started with a group called the Basket Weavers, a organisation trying to build community among young racist men. This was advertised on the website of a disgraced academic, and it was seen as a way in that would be less risky for me, a bit less of the people involved in this group weren't violent. The things they believed in might have been, but they certainly weren't going out doing anything violent, and it went from there.
And the way in for you was during the pandemic, I think, wasn't it? Or that was when your curiosity was piqued and your frustration was exacerbated.
Yeah, certainly at the time, the pandemic was much more on people's minds than it is now. And you were seeing people team up in ways that would have previously been considered unthinkable. Anti-vaccine activists and far-right extremists working together. And that was what really interested me in the far-right scene as it was growing at the time.
So, I guess this is true of an awful lot of work done by people like you. How do you ensure it gets in front of people who would actually benefit from seeing it? So I find it incredibly engaging. I find your courage extraordinary. I find some of the dangers that you exposed yourself to unbelievable. And I completely share your views of racism and your fascination with how these tentacles spread. But how do you reach people who are likely to be helped by your work as opposed to simply fascinated?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm trying to be open about the fact that what I did was maybe a little bit grubby, hence the title Year of the Rat. I don't want to give anyone the impression that I'm sitting on some big moral high horse. I undercover journalism can be a little bit mucky sometimes. And I just wanted to be open to show that the people who are featured in this book, rank and file members of far-right organisations, they are human beings. I did find myself in conversations with them that weren't entirely about extremist views. The leaders of far-right groups are one thing. I encountered, I think, a lot of grifters, a lot of people who are very cynically motivated, looking to exploit their members. But a lot of the people I met, they came to these organisations for perhaps human or reasons that we should empathise with instead of instead of really hate. I think we have to offer slightly more hopeful reasons for people to not choose to join activism like this.
I took a call just before 12 noon from a lad in Manchester called Ben who was talking about his brother, and he was describing an online rabbit hole down which his brother had gone, and it suddenly occurred to me, and I said to him that he was speaking with a lot of love. He was speaking with a sense of loss, and even sometimes almost felt that his brother was getting something positive out of simply being part of something. And there were times, I think, while you were undercover, that you were slightly surprised by some of the emotions that you felt.
Yeah, absolutely. Not just guilt at meeting people who I knew that I would ultimately have to say, look, I'm not who you think I am. My name's not Chris. Yeah. I'm actually a journalist. But also, I think I encountered a lot of people, young men in particular, who were very lonely, who were joining groups to look for community, to look for, the life had not panned out the way that they had hoped it to be. The relationships they had expected, the friendships they had expected from adult life, hadn't materialized for them. And that's where I think that we should have a lot of empathy for the people who find themselves in groups like this, while being very aware and alert to the politics that they espouse.
And it's not immediately obvious what that politics is when people are in the foothills of these organisations. The leaders are sometimes quite opaque, I think.
Absolutely. The leader of a group called Britain First is a man called Paul Golding, habitué of His Majesty's prison system. And he keeps a lot from his members. Even people who are paid up activists within his organisation, he might not tell them quite how extreme his views really are. It was only after spending best part of a year with him that I learned exactly, what he really thinks. And I think that that's why Undercover reporting on the far right is justified, because these people are putting on a mask, and that's even what one prominent eugenicist who works in Westminster told me. He said everyone puts on the mask. That's how it works, and I think it makes sense to try and turn those tactics back on them.
Eugenics are enjoying something of a comeback at the moment, aren't they?
I think so. The richest man in the world, Elon Musk, has been talking about the need for smart people to have babies. And I think that ideas about which races are superior than others, the need to maintain different types of traits, how to do that, sadly very popular ideas in Silicon Valley, and we're very worried about their spread on this side of the Atlantic.
And some break through, and you've written about Andrew Sabisky, who came in under sort of Dominic Cummings's patronage to Downing Street himself, and he was on the record as claiming that there was a far greater percentage of blacks than whites in the range of particularly low IQs. What's the relationship between racism and eugenics? Is it an attempt to cloak base bigotry in the language of intellectuals?
That's what we found, that certainly in the wider world of race science, or science that aims to advance racist opinions, is that typically it's jargonistic language that is aimed to justify a very old form of prejudice, using the trappings of academia to try and get people to believe that races are different from one another, that there are some that are inferior to each other, to try and justify ultimately segregation. And
I mean, there's a sort of pyramid in place as well, isn't there? Not all 9 of the organisations that you speak to are in any way linked or anything like that, but there is a kind of puppet master, a latter-day version of the Pioneer Fund that you really get to the heart of.
Yes, there's this group called the Pioneer Fund, and it was set up in the 1930s in the States, and one of its first acts was to try and help Nazi Germany broadcast its propaganda in the US. It became one of the biggest sources of funding for race science, not just in the US, but it also gave a lot of money in this country, and it exists in a new form under this group called the Human Diversity Foundation. And this is one of the big findings of the work that I did at Hope Not Hate. And it shows that there is a very well-funded, well-connected effort to try and spread race science into the mainstream, to policymakers, to billionaire elites who can try and make these ideas more popular.
One of the things I took from your work, and it took me by surprise, was a better understanding of the extraordinary amount of effort that is put into trying to portray places like my hometown of London, hometown since I was 19, as bad, as unhappy places, with all the talk of no-go zones and all of the abuse directed at Sadiq Khan for the perceived crime of being too integrated or being a Muslim. And of course, what I understood was that they can't bear the idea that people can actually live peacefully and happily together. It's a key part of the ideology of some of the people you encounter, if not all. That, in fact, I'll quote one of them, Jared Taylor, on a podcast, saying there is no possibility of blacks and whites living peacefully together. So I never fully understood why they had such a problem with the places that proved they were wrong. But of course, it's self-evident.
Yeah, I think you're really right to pull up that topic. I think it's becoming increasingly popular in the British mainstream. I mean, the idea that there are some types of people in this country who, no matter how many generations ago their ancestors arrived, they'll never be considered fully British. And unfortunately, I think you can see that idea spreading right now among the Reform Party. Their election manifesto, still on their website, calls for the withdrawal of citizenship from British citizens if they're of foreign descent, if they commit crimes. It doesn't specify what type of crimes, but I think it advances this idea that there will always be some people who, third, fourth, fifth generation Brits can never be considered part of this country. And, that to me speaks above the creation of a real two-tier justice system that Reform wants to, alleges Keir Starmer is always trying to create. So I think that's,
It's an abolition of equality before the law,
as you said,
isn't it? I'm pretty simply put, and part of usually a much broader project. Why you, Harry? Why did you take this upon yourself to do?
I'd become very interested in and concerned about the rise of the far right. I'd been experimenting with undercover reporting some years before, and I thought that I had been able to make connections. I'm male, I'm white, I can fit into these groups, and I wanted to see exactly what I could find out.
Were you the least surprised person in the country when the racist riots broke out in various towns last summer?
I was so sad, so dispirited. I had this awful sinking feeling because when the rioters set upon the Holiday Inn Express in Tamworth, I had been with Britain First the previous year, handing out leaflets for their by-election candidate, saying shut down the Tamworth Migrant Hotel. The type of violence that we saw in last summer didn't take place in a vacuum. No. There was a reason why people thought after the horrific stabbing of 3 young girls in Southport that it would be the right thing to do to go and smash up, set fire to, try and murder asylum seekers and migrants in 100 miles away in a hotel. I've seen how these kind of ideas spread, and I think that we have to be really aware of it and what to do about it.
What do you do next? You can't go undercover again, can you?
No, I don't want to. We're keeping a very close eye on the far right in this country, which is unfortunately growing.
Yes.
I think we have to do everything we can to try and unmask it.